Hello and welcome to this live read of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh. Today we'll be reading the final 2 chapters in the book. So, let's get into it. The Doctor. The next morning, Mr. Fitzgibbon started the larger of his 2 tractors, the huge one that he kept in the barn, the one that pulled the combine in the fall harvest, and with help from Paul and Billy, he bolted the big bulldozer blade to the front of it, rumbled it up through the barnyard grate, and stopped it near the rosebush. "We'll wait until they've come," he said, turning off the engine. Mrs. Frisby couldn't bear to watch, and yet, even more, she couldn't bear not to watch. She knew that there was nothing to be gained by it, nothing she could do. Yet how could she stay at home when the 10 rats, including Justin and Brutus, were waiting bravely underground? She couldn't. She thought at first of her watch hole in the corner post. Then she decided against it. Nearer to the rosebush on the edge of the woods stood a hickory tree, its scaly bark like a ladder inviting her to climb. 10 feet up, on a tree branch, jutting straight out, and on this branch, up close to the trunk, she had a vantage point from which, herself unseen, she could look down on the rosebush and see into the woods to a blackberry bramble where, though she had never been in it, she was sure the rat's exit must be hidden. She settled down and waited. It was a chilly morning, with a damp breeze and a gray mist that blew by in patches. Somewhere near the middle of the morning, a square white truck came into the driveway. It went first to the house. A man in a white coverall uniform climbed out and knocked on the Fitzgibbons' door. It was too far away for Mrs. Frisby to hear the knock, or to hear what the men said to Mr. Fitzgibbon when he came out on the porch, but 10 seconds later, Billy ran from the house to the barn, where Mr. Fitzgibbon was working. The man returned to the truck and waited, standing outside the open cab door. Through the windshield she could see 2 more men sat in the front seat. One of them wore horn-rimmed glasses. Now Mr. Fitzgibbon approached the truck, Billy dancing beside him, apparently in some excitement. There was a conference, none of which Mrs. Frisby could hear, accompanied by gestures toward the rosebush and the waiting bulldozer. The man in white climbed back into the driver's seat and drove the truck across the grass. He backed it up beside the bulldozer, stopping perhaps 10 feet from the bush. Mrs. Frisby stared at it. If there was anything printed on it, it must be on the other side, away from her. Then 3 men climbed out, and she could hear what they said. "It's a big one, all right," said one of the men. "And look at those thorns. It's hard to see how even a rat could get in there." The man in glasses walked around the edge of the bush, examining it closely. He bent over. "Look at this," he said. "There's the entrance hole, very neatly hidden. Look behind it. A path leading in." He turned to Fitzgibbon, who had walked up with Billy. "You are right. You'll need to bulldoze it. It would take us all day to hack our way in there, but cut it off just at the surface if you can. If you dig too deep and open the hole, they'll get away." He added, "You better tell the boy to keep back. We'll be using cyanide, and that's dangerous." Billy, after some argument, was dispatched to the back porch, where Mrs. Fitzgibbon was also watching. One of the men had walked around to the far side of the bush, the side near Mrs. Frisby's tree. "Doc," he called, "here's another entrance in the bush. There's a hole just inside it." Doc was the man in the horn rims. He was a doctor, Mrs. Frisby thought. Doctor somebody. He was in charge. "Can you get to it?" he asked. "Not very well. Too many thorns." The man, who was a doctor, walked around and looked at it. "No," he said. "Anyway, that would be the escape hatch. We'll find the main hole near the middle of the bush." He turned to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had mounted the tractor. "Okay," said the doctor. "Can you push it that way, away from the shed?" Mr. Fitzgibbon nodded, and the motor started with a roar. He pulled a lever and flexed the heavy steel blade up and down, bringing the bottom edge to the rest, just even with the ground. The blade was fully 8 feet across. He pulled another lever. The wheels, which cleated tires as tall as windows, dug in, and the blade scraped forward. The bush fought back, and then yielded angrily, snapping and crackling before the inexorable thrust of steel. A single sweep, and a third of it lay, writhing a heap of thorns in a pile 20 feet away. The ground trembled under the wheels, and Mrs. Frisby thought the 10 rats huddled below. Supposing the weight collapsed the earth, caving in the storage room and trapped them. Another sweep, and then a third, and only a thorny stubble now stood where the bush had been. On the porch, Mrs. Fitzgibbon covered her eyes with her hands. Billy cheered in excitement. Plainly exposed were 2 holes, simple round rat holes. There was no trace of the small mound nor the elegant arched entrance. Arthur had done his work thoroughly. Then she remembered his saying, "We'll give them another rear exit to block." Of course! They had dug another hole, most likely, she thought, just a dummy, leading nowhere. The men in the white suits went to action. The back doors of the truck were open and a long, flexible pipe unrolled. It looked like a fire hose, except that at the end, instead of a nozzle, there was a round thing at the end. A plunger, like a big rubber ball cut in half. One of the men donned a mask with a glass visor and a tube that ran to the back of his pack. A gas mask. The masked man pulled the hose over to the center rat hole and pressed the plunger over it, covering it completely. "All set?" the doctor called to the man in the mask. The mask nodded. "Keep back now," said the doctor to the Fitzgibbons. "Now." She turned and watched the blackberry bramble in the woods. Would they hear the pump? Where were they? Oh, let they come out. Almost a minute passed, and the men in white watched the trap. Nothing moved. Then she saw it. Behind the bramble, half hidden by a swirl of mist, a gray-brown shape, a rat, shaking dirt from his ears. Another, then 3 more. They huddled in silence, waiting. More? How many? 10? 7. Only 7. Where were the other 3? Still they waited. Then, as if by agreement, they stopped waiting. They ran, all 7 of them, not back into the woods to safety, but out of the woods towards the stubble of the rosebush, towards the men. At the edge of the bush, they stopped as if in confusion, ran to the left, ran to the right, and then fled back into the woods again. And now they were outside of the men, but not of Mrs. Frisby. Instantly they regrouped behind the blackberry bramble and charged out again, but this time in smaller numbers. First 2, then 3, then 2 again. She saw what they were up to. They were not in the least bit confused. They were making 7 rats look like 20 rats, or 40, a steady stream of them. In the midst, in the hectic turning, running, hiding, screaming, the men shouting, "Look at that! A pack of them!" "How did they get out? Get the nets!" The doctor turned off the pump. The man with the hose pulled off his mask. As a new wave of rats danced along the edge of the clearing, all 3 men ran to the truck and from it pulled long-handled nets. But Mrs. Frisby, up on her branch, was staring at the blackberry bush again. She saw something that all the others, including the rats, didn't see. An 8th rat had come out. He emerged running, but then he stumbled. He got up and ran again, and this time more slowly, circling vaguely to the right. He didn't seem to know where he was going. He reached a thicket of saplings almost out of sight, and there, abruptly, he fell over on his side and lay still. Meanwhile, all 3 men, holding their nets low, ran across the stubble toward the parade of rats, but as they approached the parade, it vanished. The rats, their purpose accomplished, melted into the misty woods. This time they did not reappear. Mrs. Frisby watched them as they loped away swiftly in single file and disappeared from her view, back into the deep forest and up the mountainside. The rear guard was gone, bound for Thorn Valley. But the 8th rat still lay unmoving among the saplings, and 2 had never come out at all. "They're gone," said the man who had worn the mask. "They fooled us." "What happened?" asked Mr. Fitzgibbon, standing near the truck. "Simple enough," said the doctor. "They had 2 escape holes. They used the other one." He walked back to the blackberry bramble and bent down, kicking the branches aside with his foot. "Here it is," he said. "Quite a long tunnel. One of the longest I've seen. Get the pick and the shovels." For half an hour they dug, laying open a narrow trench along the tunnel. From her angle of view in the tree, Mrs. Frisby could see only the top of the trench, and not down into the bottom, but still she watched, saying to her perhaps, after all, there was only 8. Maybe they decided that 8 would be enough. Then one of the shovels broke through into air. They had come into the rat storage room. "There's two of them," said one of the men, and her heart sank. Who were they? She wanted to run and look, but she didn't dare. "Careful," said the doctor. "There may still be some gas in there. Let the wind blow it out." "Phew," said one of the men. "That's not gas. That's garbage." "Open it up a little more," said the doctor. One of the men wielded his shovel for another minute, and then the doctor peered in. "Garbage," he said. "Last night's dinner, garbage, and 2 rats." Mrs. Frisby thought, "He sounds disappointed." "Only 2?" said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Yes, it's easy to see what happened. In a hole this size, there would have been a couple of dozen at least, but these 2 must have been up at the front, near the tunnel. They got a whiff of the gas, and it killed them. Before they died, they must have warned the others, so the rest ran out." "Warned them?" said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Could they do that?" "Yes," said the doctor. "They're intelligent animals. Some can do a great deal more than that." But he did not elaborate. Instead, he turned to one of the men. "We might as well take these 2 back with us." From the truck, the man produced a white paper sack and a pair of plastic gloves. He pulled the gloves on, reached into the hole, and placed the 2 dead rats into the sack. He did this with his back to Mrs. Frisby, so that she never even got a glimpse of them. "All right," said the doctor. "Let's close it up." "You'll let me know if they have rabies," said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Rabies?" said the doctor. "Yes, of course, but I doubt it. They look perfectly healthy." Perfectly healthy, thought Mrs. Frisby sadly, except for being dead. She looked into the woods over towards the sapling where the other rat lay. Was he, too, now dead? To her surprise, she saw that he was moving. Or was he? In the mist, it was hard to tell, but something had moved. After the truck had left, Mr. Fitzgibbon stood looking at the ruin of the rosebush. He seemed vaguely puzzled and disappointed. He must be wondering, she thought, whether it had been worth it just to exterminate 2 rats. He had no way of knowing, of course, that all the rest were also gone and would not return, that his grain loft was safe. In a moment he turned and walked to the house. As soon as he was safely gone, Mrs. Frisby scurried down from her tree and into the woods. On the ground she could no longer see the rat or the thicket where he lay, but she knew the direction and she ran. Around a stump, over a round of leaves, past a cedar tree, there were the saplings, and there lay the rat still on his side. It was Brutus. Beside him, futilely trying to move him, stood Mr. Ages. "Is he dead?" "No, he's unconscious, but he's alive and breathing. I think he'll revive if I can just get him to swallow this." Mr. Ages indicated a small, corked bottle, no bigger than a thimble. "What is it?" "An antidote for the poison. We thought this might happen, so we got it ready last night. He got just a little of the gas, made it this far, and then collapsed. Help me lift his head." Mr. Ages had been unable to lift Brutus's head and the bottle at the same time. Now, with Mrs. Frisby's help, he forced open Brutus's mouth and poured in just a few drops of the smoky liquid that the bottle contained. In a few seconds, Brutus made a gulping noise. He swallowed hard and spoke. "It's dark," he said. "I can't see." "Open your eyes," said Mr. Ages. Brutus opened them and looked around. "I'm out," he said. "How did I get here?" "Don't you remember?" "No. Wait. Yes, I was in the hole and I smelled gas. This sweet, choking smell. I tried to run, but I stumbled over somebody lying on the floor. I fell down. I must have breathed some of the gas. I couldn't get up. And then I heard the others running past me. I couldn't see them. It was darker than night. One of them ran into me. He stopped, pulled me up. I tried to run again, but I was too busy. I kept falling, and the other one helped me up again. I went a few steps more. He kept pulling me and then pushing. And somehow, finally, I got to the end of the tunnel. I saw daylight. The air smelled better. But there was nobody else there. I thought the others must have left, so I ran a little further, and that's all I remember." "What about the one who helped you?" I don't know who it was. I couldn't see. He didn't speak at all. I suppose he was trying to hold his breath. When we got near the end, and I could see daylight, he gave me one last shove toward it, and then he turned back. He went back. Yes, see, there was still one rat in there, the one I stumbled over. I think he went back to help that one. Whoever he was, said Mrs. Frisby, he never came out. He died in there. Whoever he was, said Mr. Ages, he was brave. Epilogue. A few days later, early in the morning, the plow came through the garden. Mrs. Frisby heard the chug of the tractor and the soft scrape of the steel against the earth. She watched from just inside her front door, fearfully at first, but then with growing confidence. The owl and the rats had calculated wisely, and the nearest furrow was more than 2 feet from her house. Behind the plow, in the moist and shining soil, the rudely upturned red-brown earthworms writhed in a frenzy to rebury themselves. Hopping along the furrow, a flock of spring robins tried to catch them before they slid from sight. And when the plowing was done, and the worms had all disappeared, either eaten or safely underground, Mr. Fitzgibbon came back with the harrow, breaking down the furrows and turning them up all over again. It was a good day for the robins. After the harrow, for the next 2 days came the Fitzgibbons themselves, all 4 of them, with hoes and bags of seeds, planting lettuce, beans, potatoes, spinach, and mustard greens. Mrs. Frisby and her family kept out of sight. Thoughtfully, Brutus and Arthur had dug their doorway behind a tuft of grass so that not even Billy noticed it. Brutus and Arthur. Mrs. Frisby didn't suppose that she would ever see either of them, nor Nicodemus, nor any of the others. Brutus, after swallowing Mr. Age's medicine and resting for half an hour, had gone on his way to join in the forest, to join the colony in Thorn Valley. There was no talk of their coming back, unless their attempt to grow their own food should fail, and she did not believe that would happen. They were too smart. And even if they did fail, they would probably now come back. They would not come back to Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm. She thought that it would be pleasant to visit them and see their new home, their small lake and their crops growing, but she had no idea where the valley was, and it would be in any case too long a journey for her and the children. She could only wonder about them. Were they, at that moment, like the Fitzgibbons, planting seeds behind their own little plow? Some, like Isabella's mother, might grumble about the hardness of the new life they had chosen. Yet the story of what had happened to Jenner and his friends, if it was Jenner and his friends, to say nothing of the destruction of their own house, would surely help to convince them that Nicodemus's idea was right. The Fitzgibbons finished their planting, and for a week or 2 all was quiet. But it wouldn't stay that way. The crops would appear, the asparagus was ready to sprout, and for the rest of the spring and summer the garden would be too busy a place for mice to live in comfortably. So on a day in May, as warm as summer, early in the morning, Mrs. Frisby and her children laid a patchwork of sticks, grass, and leaves over the top of the entrance of their cinder block house, and then carefully scraped earth over it so that it wouldn't show. With luck, they wouldn't have to dig a new one in the fall. They walked to their summer house, taking half a day to do it, strolling slowly, enjoying the fine weather, stopping on the way to eat some new spring leaves of field cress, some young poke greens, and a crisp, spicy mushroom. For their main course a little farther on, there was a whole field of winter wheat, its kernels nearly ripe and soft. As they approached the brook, toward the big tree in the hollow of whose roots they would make their summer home, the children ran ahead, shouting and laughing. Timothy ran with them, and Mrs. Frisby was glad to see that he showed no trace of his sickness. It was an exciting time for them. In the garden they were always done with themselves, but along the bank of the brook in summer lived 5 other mice families, all with children. Within a few minutes of arrival, her 4 had gone with a group of the others down to the water to see the tadpoles swim. Mrs. Frisby set about the job of tidying up the house, which had acquired a carpet of dead leaves during the winter, and then bringing in a pile of soft green moss to serve as bedding for them all. The house was a roomy chamber with a pleasant, earthy smell. Its floor was dirt, its wooden roof was an arched intertwining of roots, above which rose the tree itself, an oak. On her way to get the moss, she saw one of her neighbors, a lady mouse named Janice, who, like herself, had 4 children. Janice ran over to talk to her. "You're so late getting here," she said. "We all thought something must have happened to you." "No, we're all fine. But don't you live in the garden? I should have thought you'd be afraid of the plowing." "Well, as a matter of fact, they didn't plow the particular spot in the garden where we live. It's behind a boulder." "Oh, you were lucky." "That's true." More than that, Mrs. Frisby did not tell. She had agreed to keep a secret, and she would do so as she had said. Still, she thought after quite a long deliberation it was probably all right to tell her children, for making them promise to keep it secret. They were, after all, the children of Jonathan Frisby. For all she knew, and for all Nicodemus knew, they were likely to turn out to be quite different from other mice. They had a right to know the reason. The following evening, therefore, when they had finished an early supper, she gathered them around her. "Children, I have a story to tell you. A long one." "Oh, good!" cried Cynthia. "What kind of story?" "A true one. About your father, and about the rats." "How can it be about father and the rats?" Teresa asked. "Because he was a friend of theirs." "He was?" said Martin incredulously. "I never knew that." "Well, it was mostly before you were born." To everyone's surprise, Timothy said, "I thought he might be. I think Mr. Ages was, too." "Well, how did you know that, Timothy?" "I didn't know it, I just thought it. A couple of times I saw Mr. Ages leaving the rosebush, and I knew that father used to visit him a lot, but I never saw him near the rosebush." Probably, Mrs. Frisby thought, because he would have been careful always to leave through the blackberry bramble, just so that we wouldn't see him. They sat down outside the entrance to the house, and beginning at the beginning, with her first visit to the rats, she told them all that she had seen and done, and all that Nicodemus had told her. It took a long time to tell it, and as she talked, the sun sank low, turning the sky red and lighting the tops of the mountains, beyond which, somewhere, the rats of Nimh were living. The children's eyes grew round when she told them about the escape from Nimh, and even rounder when she described her own capture and escape from the bird-cage. But in the end, the eyes of Teresa and Cynthia were filled with tears, and Martin and Timothy looked sad. Teresa said, "Oh, but Mother, that's terrible. It must have been Justin. He saved Brutus and then went back. He was so nice." Mrs. Frisby said, "It may have been Justin. We can't be sure. It could have been one of the others." Martin said, "I'm going to find out. I'm going to go to Thorn Valley somehow, someday." "Oh, but it's too far, and we don't even know where it is." "No, but I'll bet Jeremy knows. Remember, he told you the rats had a clearing back in the hills? That must be Thorn Valley. He might even fly me there on his back, the way he did you." "But we don't know where Jeremy is either. We don't see the crows down here." "No, but in the fall, when we go back to the garden, I could find him then. If I got something shining and put it out in the sun, he'd come to get it." Martin was growing excited at his idea. "Oh, Mother, can I?" "I don't know. I doubt that the rats will want visitors from the outside." "They wouldn't mind. After all, you helped them, and so did Father. I wouldn't do any harm." "It's not something that we have to decide tonight," said Mrs. Frisby. "I'll think about it. Now, it's late. It's time for bed." The sun had set. They went into the house and lay down on the soft moss Mrs. Frisby had placed on the floor of their room outside the roots. Outside, the brook swarmed quietly through the woods, and up above them, the warm wind blew through the newly opened leaves of the big oak tree. They went to sleep. The end. Well, that's the end of Mrs. Frisby. and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. I hope you enjoyed this reading. I hope you come back tomorrow at 1:30. We're going to start reading Charlotte's Web by Evie White. So yeah, come on back at 1:30. Hope you enjoyed this. I hope you're staying happy, healthy, and safe. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this beautiful day.